Thank you so much, Tim. I'm really honored to introduce our. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. I'm really honored to introduce our distinguished virtual visitor, Dag Hasse. I hope we'll have a chance to invite him here in person as well sometime in the near future. But for now, we're really grateful for this opportunity to hear about his work. Dag and I go back to graduate school days together at the Warburg Institute. It's been nice to catch up with him just before this meeting. There we imbibed the rich resources and long academic history of Woburn Square, including its peculiar traditions around invited speakers. That's best exemplified, I think, by my own advisor, Jill Cray. I remember one time when she was chairing the weekly, very formidable director seminar. A highly distinguished Italian scholar was going to speak. Jill stepped up to the podium and said, "This is the Warburg Institute. We don't do introductions," and gestured to the bewildered visitor to begin. But I will give Dag more of an introduction than that. At the Warburg Institute, Dag wrote his dissertation under Charles Burnett on the reception of Avicenna's De Anima commentary, and that became his first book, followed by 2 successive monographs on Averroes. And most recently, he's the author of Success and Suppression, Arabic Sciences and Philosophy in the Renaissance, a book that won the Sheikh Zayed Award in 2018 for the best book on Arabic culture in other languages. He's now professor at the Institut für Philosophie in Würzburg, and he's the author of many articles and editor of several editions and collections. He's also the editor of several online projects, including Ptolemaios Arabus et Latinus. So there'll be an online roundtable tomorrow in which Therese Corey, Tom Berman, and myself will present some recent work, and Dag will be talking about some new recent developments in those 3 online projects. I believe you can get the link for that if you're interested from Tom Berman. But now I have the very great honor of turning the Zoom focus over to Dag, who will be talking about Andrea Alpago in Damascus, politics, medicine, and philosophy around 1517. Thanks, Dag.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and thank you, Tim, for the introduction and for the invitation. I see many colleagues, many friends here in these small windows. Would be much nicer, of course, to sit together in one room and to meet again. Some of you have seen recently, some quite a bit. I haven't seen for decades, but it's still good to meet this way. And I'm grateful for the invitation and also to speak to the Medieval Institute of Notre Dame, which is a place which has such a long record of studying the Middle Ages, not only with a focus on Central Europe, but on kings and castles. I mean, kings and castles are great, but there are also other people in Europe and other interesting intellectual and historical developments. And this is wonderful about the Institute today, but it was also I think a pioneer in this regard. Yeah, the focus today is on Andrea Alpago in Damascus of my lecture. And I have the year 1517 in the title. In 2017, we were celebrating 500 years anniversary, at least in solar years, of Martin Luther's theses on the door of Wittenberg Castle Church. But it is much less known that this was also the date of the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. And this conquest was the end of the Mamluk Empire, which had ruled over Egypt, Syria, and North Africa for more than 250 years. And it was at the same time, so to speak, the beginning of 400 years of Ottoman rule in the Near East. And 1517 is also important because it's an important date for colonial history of the Indian Ocean. Because when Egypt fell to the Ottomans, the Portuguese lost their last enemy on the Indian Ocean, the Mamluk Sultan in Cairo. And from then on, the Portuguese controlled the commercial routes on what we would call the maritime Silk Road, the spice trade on the Indian Ocean. And the new sea routes would lead all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and not via Alexandria or Damascus and the harbors in the Levant to Venice. So 1517, the conquest of Egypt was, of course, important for the Ottomans, was important for the Mamluk Empire and for the Portuguese, but it was also important for the grand old lady of commerce, for Venice. And Venice had dominated the trade on the Mediterranean. But the new routes avoided the Mediterranean, and thus 1517 also marks the beginning of the downfall of Venice as the commercial and colonial ruler in the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, these are important power shifts that will be indirectly a topic of my lecture. And I perhaps start my PowerPoint now that you can see the do you see the PowerPoint now, or do I have still to share the screen?
It's working good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a German map that's not entirely fully convincing for you, for those of you who don't like or can't speak German. But the nice thing about it is that I had it at hand, and also that it has the dates on it, like 1517 here for the Ottoman conquest of Egypt, and 1516 for the Ottoman conquest of Syria, Mecca a bit later, and yeah, I will come back to this soon. These power shifts will be a topic of my lecture today, but the real focus is Andrea Alpago, a physician at the Embassy of Venice in Damascus, translator from Arabic, an expert on Avicenna, on the Persian philosopher and physician, and also he was also a hunter for manuscripts. He was hunting for manuscripts, Arabic manuscripts in Syria, in Cyprus and Egypt. And he was a true intellectual with a keen eye for philosophical, medical, political and economical issues. He's an early example of a scholar diplomat, of that kind that we have much more often in Baroque times later. Why is his case so instructive? I think it is instructive because Alpago had a position between East and West in two ways, in two interesting ways. First, in a political and economical sense, as an author of letters that he sent from Damascus back home to Venice and to its ruling authorities, where he reports about the newest developments in the Middle East. And secondly, in a scientific sense, as a translator of Avicenna from Arabic into Latin, and as the author of philosophical, medical, and botanical works. What is also interesting about him is that he had this enormous geographical range from where he got his information from, up to Persia, India, and Malacca. And he was drawing on scientific works in Arabic, which were unavailable in Latin Europe. So in this double sense, he's an East-Western author. What I want to try in this lecture is to understand more of the historical situation around 1517 in politics and in science and philosophy. And I will do so by interpreting two texts written by Andrea Alpago, his last political letter extant of April 1514, and a Latin commentary, the Latin commentary on Avicenna's The Feast of the Sacrifice treatise on the afterlife, Risala al-Adhawiyya fil Ma'ad. I shall start with introducing you to Andrea Alpago and his life in Damascus, and then I will turn to these two texts and interpret them. Okay, Alpago was born sometime before 1452 in Belluno. Belluno is on the slopes of the Alps, a bit north of Venice. It's part of the Veneto. And he was from a noble family. And when he'd grown up and become a member of the Consiglio dei Nobili of Belluno, he started to study at Padua University. Now, this is sometimes in the 1470s. And when we think of these decades, we think of the high Renaissance, of Botticelli, Michelangelo, Ficino, of Florence. But Padua is, in a sense, the intellectual hub of the day. And I think Robert mentioned Jill Cray. She'd probably agree. And people from all over Europe would flock to this university, from England, from France, from Germany, like Nicolaus Copernicus, for example. In 1481, Alpago had his exam at the arts faculty of Padua in the presence of 32 doctores, professors. Well, if you think that oral exams at Notre Dame is tough, then relax and think of Padua with 32 professors in your room. And then afterwards, he studied medicine. We don't know much about this, but then came the turning point in his life. In 1487, he went to Damascus as the new physician at the embassy of Venice in Damascus. He was accompanied by his nephew, Paolo, who would later be the editor of his works. Damascus at that time was part of the Mamluk Empire. It was reigned from Cairo, where the Sultan was, and in Damascus was a vice Sultan. We know that there were Venetian consuls in Damascus at least since 1331. They were elected for 2 years. They left their wives back home and were not supposed to adopt the perspective of the foreign country. The Christian merchants lived in the Islamic countries, lived in a fondako. And these fondakos, in Arabic funduk, are building complexes. In Syria, they are called khan, and I have a photo here of a Mamluk khan. The Venetian fondako in Damascus is not, we don't have any remnants of this building, but it must have looked pretty similar to this one. And these are basically the urban equivalents to the caravanserais further in the east. You have a fountain in the middle and 2 or 3 stories. In the downstairs, magazines and animal stalls. Upstairs, accommodation for the merchants. And these fondaki had their own law and their own jurisdiction, usually. It was a bit different in different countries of the Near East. Sometimes there were other buildings in the neighborhood, a church or a bakery, for Venice usually a San Marco church. And I have here a tribute to South Bend. Olivia Remy Constable has really written a wonderful book on housing the stranger in the Mediterranean world. And she emphasizes the special character of the Christian fondakos in Damascus as compared, for example, to Alexandria, which was a bigger merchant place. And Olivia Constable was the former director of the Institute, the Medieval Institute in Notre Dame. Yeah, in Damascus, the conditions were pretty liberal for Venetian inhabitants. they were allowed to rent places outside the Venetian fondaco. And we know that in the 1480s, about 40 Venetians lived permanently in Damascus, in addition to the many pilgrims and merchants. And they were allowed to wear local Arab garment when traveling for their own safety. Alpago, who traveled in the Middle East, as I've mentioned, certainly did too. And here we have a bas-relief of 1566, which is on the facade of the family house in Belluno, still today. We see him with a turban and an oriental beard, perhaps after a portrait which the family had. It is very likely that Alpago owned oriental garment, that we know from testaments of other Venetian diplomats and merchants. This was usual. The bas-relief shows that Alpago was conceived in the Veneto as a person who was adopting the habits of Arab culture. And it's a symbol of the pride of the family in this type of person. The inscription says this, it's a Patriae Familiaeque Decus at the end, and he freed the Avicenna from countless mistakes, and this vindicavit term probably comes from Paulo Alpago, the nephew, because in a dedication in 1546, he had used a very similar term. But also Paulo is dead by then, but this was probably, the family must have had some notes or took inspiration from Paulo Alpago's view of his uncle. Another visual source on the life of Alpago possibly is a famous painting in the Louvre. This one, the reception of the Venetian ambassadors or the Venetian community in Damascus, 1511. This is by an anonymous painter, probably commissioned by the Venetian consul of Damascus, Pietro Zen. That's the theory of Caroline Campbell, back down here. It shows the arrival, probably shows the arrival of the new consul. This is the Venetian consul, and we have 5 other Venetian persons on this painting. Alpago was clearly among the distinguished Venetians of Damascus, and he may well be one of the 6 Venetians on the painting. This painting is famous also because it's the first depiction of an Oriental city which is clearly based, in Western art, which is clearly based on eyewitnesses. Because you can see the minarets here of the Umayyad Mosque, the western one and the eastern one here, and the northern one here, the cupola. And then, so this is a view from the south. Then we have a hammam, probably the hammam of the Souk al-Buzuriya. But there are also other details. This is probably the vice sultan. This is the interpreter. And we can see here, not only the minarets are authentic in their style. This was, one of these minarets was only recently built, but also we have these, the balconies, the mashrabiya balconies, which are very typical in this form of Damascus, and 3 women here and here with the tantur, cone-shaped headdress, which was typical of Syrian women, and then lemon trees and so on, and wooden railings. So the Umayyad Mosque is here. This is a 19th century map of Damascus. This is the old wall. This is the Via Recta, and the view was probably from here. it's not, it assembles also I mean, the gate is too close, but it's clearly meant to be recognizable as for someone who had been in Damascus. Now, Alpago perhaps is depicted on this painting. In spite of his long absence from Venice, he maintained close ties with his home country. And there's a telling episode. He was accused by two consuls in 1507 and in 1512 of enrichment, of peculation. And they tried to replace him with their own favorite physician. But that was of no avail, because alcuni gentilomini, some gentlemen in Venice, defended Alpago, and the Senate of Venice decided in his favor and against the consuls. The consuls were, of course, high up in the ruling class, but Alpago obviously had a power base with the nobility of Venice. He had a great reputation as a physician, and at least since 1510, it was known back in Venice that he was translating Avicenna from Arabic into Latin. The 6 letters he sent to important persons of the Venice ruling class were dated between 1504 and 1514. We have them because they are in the diary of Marino Sanudo. For instance, in 1510, he reports about a diplomatic disaster involving the Persian Shah. And his last letter extant dates from 7 April 1514. And this is the text I want to look at more closely. In this text, he relates several pieces of observation that are relevant for the future of Venice. And I give you my translation of the Italian text. I was helped here by Diego D'Angelo, Roberta Guzzetti, and Michela Summer, my colleagues here in Würzburg. In the past, I leave out the first passage. In the past, great Lord, I have written to your magnificence about matters pertaining to myself. In the current letter, I merely confirm that with God's help, the plague has been largely driven out of this area and the surrounding villages, so that we may hope for its imminent and complete extinction. Alpago, in the letter before, had mentioned an infectious disease in March. In this letter of March, he had also said that he hoped that the caravan of Mecca would soon arrive and that he would have new reports then. He now tells us in the next paragraph that the caravan has arrived, but as we will see, it was disappointing in several respects. The caravan from Mecca reached this country 6 days ago. It is reported that it brought little spice, only about 300 packloads, of which the greatest part is ginger, the rest a small amount of cloves and cinnamon. They are very expensive, since no spice ships have come to Jeddah, contrary to what had been reported before. Commercially, obviously, the caravan was disappointing. It did not bring enough spices, that's the judgment of Alpago, and no precious spices like pepper, for example. This is bad news for the merchants of Venice, whose profit depends on the transport of spices from Syria to Venice. And then the next paragraph explains the reason for the non-appearance of the spice ship in Jeddah on the Red Sea. This is the harbor close to Mecca. About the Portuguese, those who have come with this caravan report that only 4 caravels of the Portuguese have perished or been shipwrecked. Too bad. The remainder, which set out from Aden, went south, where Melek this is Malik Ayaz, the governor of Diu, which is close to present Bombay. I owe this identification to Malan Newitt of London. Provided them with plenty of provisions and every convenience and opportunity to repair their ships. The number of these ships, together with the others in the area of Calicut on the Indian coast, is about 20. These greatly hinder the transport of spices from India to Jeddah. Alpago, in an earlier letter, had reported rumors that the Portuguese fleet was dramatically decimated by shipwrecks. And that turned out not to be true. There were still 20 Portuguese ships operating on the Indian Ocean between India and the Arabian Peninsula. Here we have a map with the Portuguese settlements on the Indian west coast. And this is the area where the spice ships would be coming from Malacca and Sri Lanka, going to Aden and then into the Red Sea and to Jeddah. And then the caravan would take the pack loads to Damascus, and then they could be shipped on the Mediterranean, or they would go further north to Alexandria and then would be shipped. Alpago's information is remarkably accurate because we can confirm some details of what he says from Portuguese sources, especially by Afonso de Albuquerque himself, the famous Portuguese admiral, in his letters or cartas. Albuquerque, the so-called Caesar of the East, had laid siege on the Arab harbor city of Aden in 1513. He did not succeed and sailed to Diu. Diu is here close to Bombay, and remarking in his letters, and this is now a quotation from Albuquerque, "We repaired our small craft in this port of Milikias. He gave us an excellent reception with an abundance of gifts, foodstuffs, and generous hospitality." So this, I find this fascinating. You have the Andrea Alpago sitting in Damascus and hearing from some Arabs on the caravan from Mecca that in some months ago, Albuquerque must have gone to Diu and had a good reception there. And then we have almost the same information from the Portuguese admiral himself. But how did the Portuguese manage to obstruct the spice trade? In the next paragraph, Alpago relates a story which shows how this worked. It is reported that a José Benesagio, whom we don't know, from Damascus, coming from Calicut with a ship full of cargo with his spices, was fiercely pursued by the Portuguese caravels, so that if he had not fled very quickly to Diu with favorable winds and there promptly unloaded his spices, he would have been caught completely, together with ship and cargo, by the aforesaid Portuguese, who, it is said, besieged this ship in the aforementioned port of Diu with the intention of seizing the spice vessel. Okay, these are pirate-like tactics, so to say, and for these tactics, 20 ships were enough to basically have a blockade of the spice trade. Alpago witnessed an enormous power shift that had taken only 16 years, since 1498, when Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese, discovered the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope. From 1502 onwards, the Portuguese had built strongholds on the west coast of India. One of the first had been Cochin and Cannanore in this area. And there were also some local Indian rulers that still opposed the Portuguese, such as the ruler of Calicut. Alpago is aware of this, as the next paragraph shows. It is said and confirmed that all these countries and dominions of the Indian Ocean, from Hormuz to Cochin near Calicut, pay tribute to the Portuguese. The ruler of Calicut alone opposes cooperation with the Portuguese because he's a very powerful ruler in the area who refuses to allow either pepper or ginger, which could be loaded on the caravels of the Portuguese, to be transported from his country. In this case, Alpago's information had just been outdated. In 1513, 1 year earlier, Albuquerque had negotiated a peace treaty with the Indian ruler of Calicut, thus removing the last Indian opposition. On other issues, however, Alpago is very well informed. He had even heard rumors of Albuquerque's now famous conquest of Malacca, Malaysia in 1511, the first colonial action in Southeast Asia, and a heavy blow to Arab sea trade. Alpago relates these rumors and then, in the last part of the letter, mentions two powers of the Middle East that I had mentioned in the beginning of my lecture, on which he sets his hope: the Mamluk Sultan al-Ruri in Cairo and the young Persian Shah Ismail. About the island of Malacca and the island of Sri Lanka, some from Mecca claim that these islands are the hands of the Portuguese, and others say the opposite. But everyone agrees that the Portuguese have not suffered shipwrecks or been diminished in their power to the extent previously claimed. In this regard, it is also reported that the Sultan, i.e. al-Ruri, the Sultan of the Mamluk Empire, has gone to Suez to send his army to the Indian Ocean against the Portuguese, and that the ruler of Calicut eagerly awaits this army of the Sultan in order to drive the Portuguese out of this country, out of India, and to overthrow the rulers of Cochin and Cananor, its neighbors, who support the Portuguese. I only report what I have heard. Give it such credence as seems best to you. I ask God that he may do the best for our nation. Prego Dio provvedi al meglio della nación nostra. About the ruler Sofi, that is the Persian Shah Ismail, nothing has yet been heard concerning his return to Tabriz. The ambassador of the Sultan, who is returned from Constantinople, arrived in Aleppo, has not yet left this place, etc. This is what we have of this letter. This is the end. Alpago sets his hopes, and that of the Republic of Venice, on an old ally, the Mamluks, and on a potential new ally, Persia. Shah Ismail is the founder of the Safavid dynasty in Persia, which will rule Persia for more than 200 years until 1722, I think. Ismail came from a family of leaders of a Sufi order in Azerbaijan. In 1501, he had proclaimed himself Shah and had made Twelver Shi'ism the official religion of Persia, or of the area that he ruled. Until 1510, Ismail had conquered an area that comprises today's Iraq, Iran, and Western Afghanistan. Alpago was enthusiastic about Shah Ismail and reports about him very positively in all 6 letters to Venice that we have. And we have, I think, in the audience, Margaret Miserve, who's written a very wonderful study on how in Central Europe Shah Ismail was perceived. There were many intellectuals, many politicians and merchants and historians who thought this would be a new prophet in the East, but also a rescue from the Ottoman Empire. But Alpago's hopes, and those of Venice, were to be shattered very soon by the Ottomans. In August 1514, that is only 4 months after Alpago's last letter, Shah Ismail's army suffered a crushing defeat against the Ottomans in the well-known Battle of Chaldiran. Now, here we are back. Chaldiran is here. This is today the border area of Iran and Turkey. This battle is also famous because it's one of the first which was won by artillery. I mean, others also won by artillery, was one among the first. The dynasty survived, the Safavid dynasty, and ruled in the area for a long time. But Shah Ismail himself retreated from military campaigns and in fact from politics. 2 years later, in 1516, Andrea Alpago must have seen with his own eyes the entry of the Ottoman Sultan Selim I in Damascus. Here we have the 1516. After the defeat of the Mamluk army in Marj Dabik. 1517 then followed the Ottoman conquest of Egypt, the end of the Mamluk Empire, the end of the naval war between the Portuguese and the Mamluks, which had lasted 12 years. And thus, as I said, the economic supremacy of Venice in the Mediterranean was beginning to shake. Andrea Alpago, as a far-sighted observer, realized how dangerous the situation was. I asked God that he may do the best for our nation. Now, this letter of April 1514 is an impressive testimony. But why? The letter is not a political memorandum, but it is more than a series of observations and remarks, because Alpago makes implicit and explicit comments that are very interesting for us. For instance, 300 packloads, it seems quite a lot for a caravan from my judgment, is not enough for a caravan from Mecca. The spices named are not precious enough, and the prices are too high. The 20 Portuguese ships are enough to massively obstruct seafaring on the maritime Silk Road. The Indian ruler of Calicut is a potential ally and a powerful ally, etc. It is these and similar assessments that make the letter precious. Alpago had almost 30 years experience in the Near East, and he saw coming what in fact happened in the future, the gradual downfall of the trade empire of Venice. This is just one letter, but what I like about it is that we can see great events of global history encapsulated in it through Alpago's eyes. And sometimes for us scholars, these great events have become hollow phrases because we hear them too often, like the Reformation or the beginning of European colonialism. And then a detail like this letter tells us very much in very few words and make larger concepts meaningful again. I return now to Italy with Alpago, because Alpago's life was changed by the dramatic political and military events. In March 1517, after the Turkish conquest of Damascus, Alpago left Damascus and worked for 3 years as a physician on Cyprus, which was under Venetian rule at that time. We don't know why Alpago departed from Damascus. I presume he was not welcome anymore because his anti-Ottoman, anti-Turkish convictions were very well known. But why did he not return to Venice in 1517? We know that he had pondered returning in 1506. The reason seems to me, I don't think this was suggested before, that it was Alpago's aim from the beginning to return not only to Venice, but to Padua University and to be offered a medical professorship at the university. But the University of Padua was closed since 1509 because the Republic of Venice was in war with the League of Cambrai, and Padua was under siege for some time. Academic teaching began gradually only from 1517 onwards in Padua. And this, I think, is the reason why Alpago waited. He returned to Venice on 12th December 1520 and immediately got in contact with the University of Padua. He submitted his Arabic Latin translations to the faculty, the Sacro Collegio of Philosophers and Physicians of Padua University. The Sacro Collegio convened 1 month later in January. The prior, i.e. the dean of our times, opened the meeting with the following words. This is my translation. I skip a bit and then he mentions Alpago, and for a long time entertained familiarity and contacts with a certain excellent Arab physician and greatest expert in the Arabic language. This is Ibn al-Makki. I will return to him. From this man, Alpago learned much and thus became so brilliant that he corrected and translated certain passages of Avicenna in the canon of medicine. As a result, many passages of the same Avicenna, which had been obscure, were now made clear and obvious. And he also translated some further Arabic books into Latin. Surely, in our time, we could not have a more laudable and more necessary enterprise, magis laudabilem ad necessarium, than this correction and translation. As a result, the Collegio officially recommended Alpago's corrections to the canon of medicine. These corrections are important philological accomplishments in themselves. I won't talk about this today. I have a chapter on this in my book, Success and Suppression of 2016. It's very impressive. I mean, it's philological in a non-humanist manner, what Alpago does. He doesn't change the style of Gerard of Cremona's translation or the vocabulary, but he's concerned with correct syntax, with terminological consistency, and with extinguishing mistakes. Okay, these corrections were printed after Alpago's death in 1527 by his nephew Paulo Alpago, and later in many early modern canon editions, either on the margin or integrated into the text. Alpago was offered in September an extraordinary professorship in practical medicine, but he died half a year later in 1522 in January in Padua. Even with this untimely death, Alpago's return to Venice after more than 30 years of absence was an impressive success, and that was not self-evident. In several respects, he was welcomed by the Venetian ruling class, he was welcomed by the professors of the university, and he was welcomed by the medical readers of the 16th century in Central Europe. Alpago obviously had a great talent for bridging cultures. I now leave politics and turn to medicine and philosophy. Because of his knowledge of Arabic, in fact, excellent knowledge of Arabic, Alpago had access to a broad range of sources that were not accessible to his contemporaries in Latin Europe. In medicine, he focused mainly on Avicenna, plus Serapion, two authorities that were very important for Latin medicine. We have here a list of his translations, the whole, canon, these are corrections to the canon, and to other small treatises by Avicenna, here medical treatises. And this is a collection of philosophical treatises, the Compendium of 1546. I will talk about this very soon. This is interesting. He also translated commentaries on the canon, Arabic commentaries by Ibn Nafis and Qutb ad-Din al-Shirazi, selections, and Ibn al-Makki, his teacher in Damascus, was using the same commentaries we know. By the famous botanist Ibn al-Baita, a treatise on lemons, and corrections to the Practica by Johanna ibn Sarabion. But what is, for his intellectual profile, what is more interesting is his own works. And the first is a lexicon of transliterated Latin names for drugs, plants, minerals, animals, etc. in Avicenna's canon. He offers explanations of 2,050 Arabic terms, transliterated Arabic terms in Latin, often simple id est identifications, but also long discussions. I think it's a brilliant text and a very good idea, because he took up the genre of synonyma literature of the Western genre and filled it with first-hand information. But I will concentrate today on this, Avicenna's Compendium de Anima. This is translations of 6 treatises by Avicenna with commentaries by Alpago. The Compendium on the Soul, the Feast of the Sacrifice, treatise on the Afterlife, Notes on the Soul, Definitions, Answers to 10 Questions, and the Divisions of Philosophy. These commentaries in Latin were not written on Cyprus, but still in Damascus, since Alpago mentions an Arab teacher of his, Muhammad ibn al-Makki, Reis ibn Machi, Preceptor meus, my teacher, Physicus inter omnes Arabes primarius, the leading physician of all Arabs. And we have, fortunately, the study by Yahya Michaud. It's a study on the the Risala Atawiya of Avicenna and Ibn Taymiyyah's comments on this. So it's only indirectly really on Muhammad ibn Makki, but we have some pages by Michaud on Ibn al-Makki. I just have this for your reference in here. We know that Ibn al-Makki was the principal physician of Damascus, the court physician of the Vice Sultan, and an eminent scholar in medicine, astronomy, geometry, natural philosophy, and metaphysics. He was not a Shi'i, but was purported to be so by contemporaries. Perhaps Ibn al-Makki was a follower of Shah Ismail, we don't know. He may have been the source for Alpago's enthusiasm for Shah Ismail, the Shi'i leader of Persia. Ibn al-Makki certainly was Alpago's instructor on the philosophy of Avicenna, as this quotation shows from Alpago's commentary. And although the first opinion, out of a total of 3 opinions disseminated among the Muslims, asserts that everything happens out of necessity, the opinion of Arabic philosophers like Avicenna al-Ghazali, as is clear from what has been said, and as Rais ibn Maih, Ibn al-Makki, my teacher, reported, agrees with the Christian position. Now, the 3 opinions mentioned here is determinism, free will, or free acting, and the third is a compatibilist position that God bestowed free will upon humans, but at the same time has complete foreknowledge of everything happening in the future. And this is, he says, what Avicenna, al-Ghazali, and the Christians believe. Human acts are free, Alpago says, and determined at the same time because God knows everything through the radiation and the light of his essence, as the Arab Sufis say, Arabes Sufi Dikont. This obviously seems to be the doctrine of al-Makki. If it's an interpretation of Avicenna, it's a daring interpretation, or could almost say wrong interpretation of Avicenna's position, which cannot be found in the treatises that Alpago comments on here. In the Metaphysics of Ashifa, Avicenna says that God does not know everything, but that he knows all particulars in a universal way, ala nahum kulli. Restricting God's knowledge thus guarantees the contingency of particular events and free will. Okay, there's so much about Ibn al-Makki. What can we say about Alpago's philosophical position? Is it related to late scholastic philosophy, to humanist philosophy, or to philosophy in the Middle East? I will concentrate on the treatise on the afterlife, the Feast of the Sacrifice treatise on the afterlife, Risala Atawiya fil Ma'ad. The title probably means the treatise on the afterlife written on the day or on the occasion of the Feast of the Sacrifice, one of the 2 major Muslim feasts. This is the most comprehensive work on the life of the soul after the death of the body that Avicenna had written. It was very popular in the Arabic East, less so in the Arabic West, so North Africa and Andalusia. And perhaps that's the reason why it was not translated into Latin in Spain in the 12th century by Gonsalvi or others. And it is a treatise that is often overlooked in modern Avicenna studies. Briefly, on the content of this treatise, first, Avicenna discusses the meaning of afterlife. Then he discusses 3 theological theories about the afterlife, either only bodies return or souls return, or bodies and souls together. And the third position is that of the Muslims, and in a less convincing way of the Christians. He argues in chapter 3 against position 1 and 3, hence no bodies return. And then he has a long discussion and refutation of the concept of transmigration or reincarnation tanasuch. And his main argument is against the pre-existence of the soul. Then in chapters 4 and 5, Avicenna discusses his own position and gives a version of the flying man, a famous thought experiment, without the image, however, of a flying man. The thought experiment is the following: humans can live without, I cannot live without the heart, but one can imagine a human being without a heart, fitawachum, in imagination. And such a fictional human being, quote, would know that his essence exists, and possibly does not know that his heart exists, end of quote. This shows the essence of the soul is a substance that is separate from the heart and the body and the organs, and it exists through itself. For the afterlife, this means only the rational part of the soul is immortal, but not the sense-perceptive part. There's no bodily afterlife, because the sense-perceptive part needs organs. In the last two chapters, Avicenna discusses happiness and punishment in the afterlife. Happiness consists in knowing the essence of God, and the inability to know the essence of God is punishment. There's no third alternative in addition to happiness and punishment. Now, as many of you may know, some Muslim theologians like Ghazali believed that this is unbelief. This is that Avicenna's theory amounts to kufr, to unbelief, because it denies a bodily afterlife. It's also more impressive that Alpago's commentary is completely relaxed. There's no sense of kufr, of unbelief, lurking anywhere. And obviously this had not been a problem with his partners of discussion in Damascus. The paraphrase of, or the commentary of Alpago is very readable and fluent. The Latin style is not humanist, it's rather academic. But it's not a question format, it's not scholastic. It's freely paraphrasing, interpreting, discussing lemma after lemma of the text. Now, it's remarkable that Alpago follows Avicenna on almost all matters of doctrine, even in religious matters. He does not comment on Avicenna's critique of Christianity. There's no signal of distance here. With the sole exception of the theory of demons, which, quote, according to Christian theologians and according to the truth, are not wandering souls that have been separated from their bodies, but demons are immaterial substances. Alpago emphasizes repeatedly that Avicenna's position differs from that of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In particular, resurrection of the bodies cannot be proved naturaliter, in a natural way, but is a matter of faith and a matter for religion. Alpago does not say so directly, but he clearly favors Avicenna's philosophical concept of a purely intellectual afterlife. Now, do we have any traces of Alpago's time in Padua, of his academic upbringing as a student in this commentary? We know from the studies of Dalverny and Lucetta that Alpago quotes 5 Latin authors in his commentaries: Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Scotus, Giles of Rome, and Pietro d'Abano. But in all, these are only about a dozen scholastic quotations in the entire book. Let us turn to 2 scholastic passages that I find particularly interesting. Both come from chapter 5. Alpago starts his commentary on chapter 5 as follows. In this chapter, Avicenna proves that the soul subsists by itself, or that it can exist without the body, and then in existing, it is exempted from the body and does not need it. As a consequence, he then proves that the soul persists after the death of the body, and that the body is something external to the soul. And then a few lines further down, he says, note that St. Thomas in Summa Contra Gentiles, book 2, chapter 51, proves that the intellectual substances, substantiae intellectuales, are independently existing forms, and not forms existing in matter, as if their being would depend on matter. This is a very reasonable summary of what Avicenna says in this chapter, and then follows a commentary on single lemmata. The quotation of the Summa contra Gentiles is correct. It is even literal. And Avicenna and Aquinas indeed have similar positions here. Both hold the immortality of the rational soul. But Thomas Aquinas, in this passage, speaks not only of the human rational soul, but of immaterial substances in general, substantia intellectuales. In Book 2 of the Summa, Aquinas differentiates two groups of immaterial substances. First, those that can be united with the body, namely souls. And second, the separate immaterial substances such as angels, who essentially exist without a body. Hence, Alpago's quotation obscures the fact that Aquinas' theory of the rational soul differs from Avicenna's and his own in a crucial point. Thomas emphasizes that the soul is the form of the body, anima forma corporis, famously, whereas Avicenna argues that the term form is not fully appropriate for the soul, even though Aristotle uses it, because it implies a relation to matter, and as a result, the term form jeopardizes the separateness of the soul and its being a substance. Let us now turn to the second scholastic passage. It's again in chapter 5. Intellectual activity, to be sure, is to some extent dependent on an organ in terms of its acquisition, arrival, and origin, according to Aristotle's statement in the first book of the Analytica Posteriora. Our entire cognition begins with perception, and according to a sentence in the Anima, the cognizer must necessarily contemplate the mental images, etc. Nevertheless, so he says, to be sure, there's an empirical basis, but nevertheless, if the soul has acquired knowledge, for example, a conclusion about any general concept, and if that state of knowledge of the soul has become permanent, the soul can pass into an actual cognition of that knowledge by itself alone, without any dependence on the body or the mental images. Alpago here comments on a passage where Avicenna describes the intellectual activity of the soul as being completely separate from any matter and organ. But nowhere in the treatise on the afterlife does Avicenna discuss the question whether we need mental images, phantasmata, for thinking. This is a central question for Aristotle. He had raised it several times in his De Anima and De Memoria. Aristotelian passages such as the soul never thinks, noein, without an image, phantasma. These were certainly known in Arabic too, but they are much more central to medieval and Renaissance Latin philosophy. Two Latin examples, Aquinas and Pietro d'Abano. First, Aquinas, he has this very central epistemological position. There's no cognition without turning to the phantasmata. And in the Summa contra Gentiles, because of this connection between thinking and images, human beings cannot in this life know the essence of the separate substances or even of God. So that's a very radical way to read Aristotle's sentence. And Pietro Pomponazzi is perhaps even more radical, who studied in Padua only a few years after Alpago, also philosophy and medicine. Pomponazzi published in 1516 De Immortalitate Animae, which became a philosophical scandal, the scandal of Renaissance philosophy, perhaps. And here, the Aristotelian sentence, the soul never understands without an image, becomes the main argument for the provocative thesis that the soul is essentially mortal. So he could have called his treatise De Mortalitate Animae. We see here this issue of the turning towards the phantasmata is a central piece of scholastic discussions. And Alpago obviously was aware of this and abreast with some of these key issues of Latin philosophy of his time. And also his choice to translate Avicenna's smaller treatises on the soul may well be a reaction to the boom of the anima commentaries in Renaissance Padua and in Renaissance Italy, in fact. But Alpago differs from Aquinas and even more so from Pomponazzi in an important respect. He does not emphasize the dependence of the soul on the body, but as we have seen in the quotation, he believes that the intellect can pass by himself into actual cognition without any dependence on perceptions and mental images. Once the intellect has fully abstracted a universal, the intellect can return to this without using the lower faculties. This indeed is a very Avicennian theory, which Avicenna does not discuss in the Feast of the Sacrifice treatise, but in his major psychological writings like the Anima. Obviously, Alpago knew these more comprehensive psychological writings. Avicenna compares the lower faculties to a riding animal, a dabba, that is used to reach a certain place, and that becomes useless and a hindrance after you arrive at that place. Thomas Aquinas knows this simile and rejects it, but his teacher, Albertus Magnus, is closest to Alpago's and Avicenna's position. He adopts Avicenna's allegory of the riding animal. Having acquired complete intellectual knowledge is like arriving in your home country, in your patria, Albertus says, and then you do not need a traveling vehicle anymore. In view of this kinship between Alpago's and Alberto's reception of Avicenna, should we use the label Avicennism for Alpago's philosophical position? Marie-Thérèse d'Alvany and Francesca Lucchetta, who have really lifted Andrea Alpago from oblivion 60 years ago, they believed that Alpago is part of a Renaissance current of philosophical Avicennism in Italy, whose main protagonists are Marsilio Ficino and Andrea Catani. I think most scholars today would disagree, I certainly disagree. The evidence in the sources for the existence of such a current is too small. In 1500, Avicenna had ceased to be a capital authority on metaphysics and psychology, on a few issues, yes, but it's very different, the situation from the 13th century. He is now read as a physician in the first place, and that contrasts greatly with Averroes, of course, the most famous Arab philosopher in the Renaissance. And moreover, Alpago's philosophical position is formulated in the vocabulary of Latin Aristotelianism, and there we can see his Paduan upbringing, and is far away from the vocabulary of Ficino, of a Platonic or Neoplatonic author. Okay, when we now look at Alpago's philosophical position, we have keywords like epistemological optimism for this life, separability of the rational soul, skepticism about the concept of form as applied to the soul, also the denial of intellectual memory, and the doctrine of the giver of forms in other passages. With all this, Alpago is a lonesome stranger in Latin Aristotelian philosophy around 1500 in Central Europe, which is dominated by Averroes, Alexander of Aphrodisias, and Aquinas, and others. But when we turn to the Middle East, to the philosophy of the Middle East around 1500, the situation is just the other way around. Alpago is part of a current, and a current which is about to grow. Many of Alpago's Avicennian doctrines can be found, for instance, in Al-Abhari's Hidayah al-Hikmah, the Guidance in Philosophy. This is a 13th century textbook, which was taught in many of the Islamic schools, the madrasas, especially in the Mamluk Empire. And this textbook was the one which Ibn al-Makki was using for teaching natural philosophy. Moreover, Avicenna's treatises on the afterlife found already many readers in the Arabic East before 1500, but this tendency will increase in Iran in Persia in the 16th and 17th centuries in Safavid Iran, that is under Shah Ismail's successors, which is then a period in which Avicennian philosophy flourished. And with it, Avicennian philosophy of the afterlife, of the Ma'ad. Ibn al-Makki and Alpago stand on the threshold to this booming phase of Avicennism. Hence, in the context of the Middle East, Alpago was a part of a broader philosophical current, but in the context of Central Europe, he was a philosophical outsider. And this may also explain why the 1546 edition found hardly any readers, as far as we can see today. This contrasts signally with Alpago's medical writings. His corrections to Avicenna's canon and his lexical work were a great success with Latin readers. And the reason here is that Avicenna's canon of medicine, the Qanun fi Tibb, was valued highly both in the Latin world and the Arabic world in the Middle East. To put it in one sentence, Alpago's medical Avicennism was an East-Western Avicennism. It was very international. Alpago's philosophical Avicennism, on the other hand, was distinctly Eastern. Andrea Alpago is an exceptional figure among his contemporaries, and is one of my secret heroes in history. The sheer spatial range of his scientific horizon is impressive. That's one aspect. And the other is that he's more than a mirror of his time. He's also an interpreter of his time. He's an acute observer who offers us an understanding of the political and economical situation. And he's a philosopher with a reading of Avicenna that opens a window to understanding the philosophical developments in the Middle East before and after 1517. Thank you for listening.